If you legalized marijuana, it would be the biggest part of your legacy. So what are your thoughts
When
on
I was about your age, my dad was incarcerated too. Incarcerated is when someone breaks the law, a grown-up rule, and then they have to go to jail or prison.
I think there is no doubt that our criminal justice system generally is so heavily skewed towards cracking down on nonviolent drug offenders.
I think people are starting to feel, you know what, we've gone the wrong direction, but we've just gone too far.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, lobbyists outnumber politicians in Washington, D.C. more than 22 to 1. In the U.S., lobbying is a $3.2 billion industry with 12,000 registered federal lobbyists, influencing elected officials and federal agencies, according to the Center for Responsive Politics. However, lobbyist spending has actually been on the decline since 2010, when more than $3.5 billion was used. But lobbyist influence runs deep on Capitol Hill. Many lobbyists are always in-house, and lobbying firms are headquartered next to the House of Representatives. In the United States, corporations and unions regularly use lobbyist firms, often made up of former and future politicians, to coerce, misinform, and bribe elected officials to create legislation favorable to special interests.
Congressional lobbying experts, however, argue that lobbying isn't decreasing at all, and instead it's simply going underground.
Even though lobbyists continue to deregister in the U.S., according to American University professor James Thurber, who has studied congressional lobbying for more than 3 decades, most of what is going on in Washington is not covered by the lobbyist registration system. Despite the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which requires lobbyists to register making their spending and actions accessible to the public, Thurber and other experts say most lobbyists are not registered.
The Lobbying Disclosure Act is riddled with loopholes. There are many ways for lobbyists to evade the law, and simply put, there aren't many incentives for lobbyists to register, and the law does not cover all lobbying activity. So the real figure on how many lobbyists are in D.C. that are actively attempting to influence policy is closer to 100,000, not 12,000. And experts say the amount spent is not $3 billion, but closer to maybe 6, 9, or even 10 billion.
Unbelievable. And you're talking about all these loopholes under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, named after former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. Why is he the face of unregistered lobbyists?
Well, Senator Tom Daschle left the Senate, joined a private equity firm, also joined a law and lobbying firm, Alston and Bird. He's now at another one called DLA Piper. He's become the face of the problem because everyone knows that Tom Daschle lobbies, that he meets with government officials, that he meets with President Obama, that he coordinates meetings with legislators, with policy folks, and businesses from healthcare and energy to other sectors. And he does this openly, and at the same time, he does not register. So given his prominence in Washington, D.C., helping President Obama with his healthcare overhaul, associated with many different think tanks and constantly in the news and at different functions in the city, he does all of this while flouting the law.
According to Lee Fung, who has investigated congressional lobbying in the U.S. for years, the LDA is simply not enforced.
The enforcement mechanism to the Lobbying Disclosure Act basically has no cop on the beat. There's never been a criminal enforcement case brought ever. There have been virtually no civil cases either, and that's because the only people overseeing this process of making sure people register and comply with the law, there's only one full-time employee at the Department of Justice. That's a contract paralegal who basically just processes the forms. some other kind of file keepers in Congress also look into this. But if you simply don't register and you continue influence peddling, there's no enforcement mechanism to go after folks.
Big pharma, big alcohol, big tobacco, police unions, and the rest surely expect returns on their substantial investments in the form of legislation.
Lobbyists write bills every day. They're sponsoring legislation, but there's no system to keep tabs on that.
Possibly the largest and most well-funded opponent of cannabis legalization is the pharmaceutical industry, as weed can replace numerous prescription drugs used to treat many illnesses. According to the Center for Responsive Politics, the pharmaceutical lobby is the largest in the U.S., with about $230 million spent in 2014. The lobby is even larger than oil and gas lobbies, which spent about $141 million the same year.
In an eye-opening investigative piece in The Nation, reporter Li Feng pulls back the curtain, writing, quote, "It's more than a little odd that Community Anti-Drug Coalitions of America and the other groups leading the fight against relaxing marijuana laws, including the Partnership for Drug-Free Kids, formerly the Partnership for Drug-Free America, derive a significant portion of their budget from opioid manufacturers and other pharmaceutical companies." According to Fong, quote, "Legalization's biggest threat is to the bottom line of these same special interests, which reap significant monetary advantages from pot prohibition that are rarely acknowledged in the public debate."
In 2006, then Congressman Patrick Kennedy crashed his car into a barricade on Capitol Hill. The event revealed Kennedy had been abusing prescription drugs, including the opioid painkiller OxyContin, leading to several rehab visits. In 2013, Kennedy founded Project SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, which has been advocating to keep cannabis illegal ever since.
I just don't think for our country, if we care about the mental health and development of our young people and our country as a whole, that we really want to invite a new big tobacco. That's the new marijuana industry. But there does seem there's
a bit of a striking irony in the fact that your own personal experience, I think, which you would say led to the work you did, the if I might say excellent work you did on mental health parity, which I think was a huge win for the American people, that your own experience was actually with drugs that were legal, which would seem to sort of show exactly how arbitrary in many senses the line that we draw is. I mean, there are thousands of people who struggle with alcohol addiction.
Yes,
and the point that the people that are arguing for legalization make is precisely that. The line between the legal and the illegal is not bounded on any rational basis.
Well, you make a good point, Chris, and that is that, we have basically accepted because it's a prescribed drug. I took it. I loved it. I'm an addict. It doesn't matter what I take. I want to be in some other place of my mind. And so marijuana, when they say it's gateway, it's really tobacco and alcohol. You start with that, then you want more, so no one dies with a needle in their arms because they started with heroin. They started drinking, they started using marijuana, and then they wanted more. And the problem I have is now you're going to have a commercialized industry that's going to be marketing. Their for-profit is going to be based upon how many people like me who they can get to abuse and be addicted to their product. That's who they make their money off of.
In 2014, Kennedy and thousands of other anti-cannabis crusaders met at the annual CADCA, Community Anti-Drug Coalition of America convention in Washington, D.C. Instead of discussing the issue of overprescribed painkillers, which Kennedy himself struggled with, he used his time on stage to demonize cannabis. This may have been because Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, sponsored the convention. According to Li Feng, many of the largest anti-pot advocacy groups, including CADCA, rely on significant funding from painkiller companies, including Purdue Pharma and Alkermes.
Purdue Pharma, the makers of OxyContin, has provided hundreds of thousands of dollars to many of the largest drug prevention groups. These drug prevention groups are spending their resources, their money, not on fighting prescription painkiller abuse, which is an epidemic. The CDC says it kills over 16,000 people a year. Instead, they're focusing most of their resources on fighting marijuana, which some experts say is a cheaper, safe alternative. The record shows that these large drug prevention groups have refused to join coalitions to reform how prescription drugs are prescribed in America. Something like 84% of hydrocodone products in the whole world are consumed by Americans, even though we constitute less than 5% of global population. So this is a big epidemic, and these drug prevention groups appear to have been co-opted by the industry and instead are focusing on marijuana.
The CADCA event was also attended by law enforcement agencies, pharmaceutical companies, and non-profits funded by federal drug prevention grants that have a stake in keeping cannabis illegal. Another anti-cannabis lobbyist with ties to pharmaceutical companies is Dr. Herbert Kleber of Columbia University. He often warns of the dangers of cannabis use in the media and academic publications, and as a distinguished doctor, his statements hold weight. What Kleber doesn't mention is that he's a paid consultant for many leading drug companies, including Purdue Pharma, Reckitt Benckiser, the producer of a painkiller called Nurofen, and Alkermes, the producer of a painkiller called Zohydro. Furthermore, Kleber's work was cited by the New York State Association of Police Chiefs in its opposition to cannabis legalization, and he warned against cannabis for medical use in an American Psychiatric Association statement.
Physicians who give these medical marijuana cards may be guilty of medical malpractice.
Another paid shill for the most damaging drugs in America is Dr. A. Eden Evans, an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. She's on the board of anti-cannabis advocacy group Project SAM and has been in the media criticizing the surge of new cannabis reforms. Evans is also a consultant for Pfizer and DLA Piper and has received grant money from Forum Pharmaceuticals, formerly Envivo, GlaxoSmithKline, and Pfizer, makers of painkillers and other prescription drugs. Painkiller-funded researchers like Kleber and Evans helped create America's deadly addiction to opioid painkillers. According to Fung, these academics with quiet funding from major pain pill firms encourage doctors to overprescribe these drugs for a range of pain relief issues, leading to where we stand today as the world's biggest consumer of painkillers and the overdose capital of the planet. Fung asks, what does it say about medical academia that painkiller-funded researchers are now standing in the way of a safer alternative, smoking a joint? Police also rely on cannabis prohibition as a source of revenue. According to the FBI, arrests for cannabis possession have more than tripled since 1991, while overall arrests have decreased in the same time period. About 658,000 Americans were arrested for pot possession in 2012, about 42% of all drug arrests, according to the FBI. Additionally, in New York, 1 out of 8 arrests were for cannabis in 2012. According to the ACLU, states spend about $3.6 billion on cannabis enforcement annually. Police unions also make use of lobbyists to further the drug war.
Law enforcement is spending big bucks this year lobbying against marijuana reform laws, decriminalization, legalization, medical marijuana. So there's big money at stake, and these interest groups have been willing to flex their muscle.
John Lovell is a lobbyist for the police associations in Sacramento and a major player in grabbing federal dollars to shut down the California weed industry. In 2010, Lovell managed the opposition campaign against California's Prop 19, a measure to legalize and tax cannabis. Opponents of the bill ran ads, organized rallies, and spread conspiracy theories about billionaire George Soros to confuse voters. Lovell's lobbying firm was paid about $386,000 from various police unions, including the California Police Chiefs Association, and the bill was defeated. Police unions also contributed more than $100,000 to a campaign account used to coordinate opposition to Prop 19. Furthermore, Lovell represented a police association in a bid to steer about $2.2 million into his so-called marijuana suppression program. Additionally, in 2009 and 2010, California police associations sought more than $7.5 million in federal money from police to conduct a campaign against marijuana planting program. The anti-cannabis money went directly into the paychecks of many officers. In 2013, Lovell also protested Bill SB 439, which allows legal cannabis companies to conduct business without facing prosecution.
What this bill does is enables, it gives legal legitimacy to medical marijuana dispensaries. First time that's happened. And these are, despite what has been said by others, a blight on neighborhoods.
This isn't just happening in California, however. Federal lobbying disclosures show that police union lobbyists have pushed for harsher penalties for cannabis nationwide. Unfortunately, the drug war rhetoric is so entrenched in the minds of police, it has led to an over-militarized police force that continues to seek funds and grow.
Radley Bauco has spent the last decade documenting this increasing militarization of American police forces and all the abuses and rights violations that come with it. His book, Rise of the Warrior Cop, lays out how small-town American cops ended up with tanks and assault rifles.
When did tanks become a facet of
American policing.
It really wasn't until the early to mid-'80s that we saw the sort of mass transfer of military equipment from the Pentagon to local police departments as a matter of policy. The Reagan administration really wanted to take the war on drugs metaphor and make it very literal.
Drugs are menacing our society, and by next year, our spending for drug law enforcement will have more than tripled.
Reagan sort of just informally instructed the Pentagon to start making surplus gear available. Reagan instituted these federal grants that were tied solely to drug policing.
Reagan's drug war block grants beget the 1033 program, started in 1990 under Bush, which gave surplus Army gear to the domestic police departments for use against drugs, provided they used the equipment at least once within a year, which all but assured that they did.
And this is where we start to see the armored personnel carriers, the tanks, the helicopters, the grenade launchers, this really heavy-duty gear that was explicitly designed for use on a battlefield being transferred to police departments for use on American streets and American neighborhoods and against American citizens.
The 1033 program was so popular with police departments, by 1996 the DoD had given out $330 million worth of old military gear. Now, thanks to surpluses created by our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, cops in America have 1033 to $5 billion worth of used Army gear. And on top of that, since 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security has given cops an extra $35 billion so they can buy new gear to fight terrorists with.
You have a militarized mentality. A lot of police departments have switched to these battle dress uniforms. You get the rhetoric, it's the constant sort of intonation that you're fighting a war. And these are two very fundamentally different jobs. Unfortunately, I think a lot of politicians think because they both involve carrying guns and using force, that the skill sets are interchangeable. When the amount of hours you spend at the shooting range outnumber the number of hours you spend learning conflict resolution, and by 10 or 15 to 1, you're going to be more likely to use the tool that you've trained more with.
While SWAT teams and their tanks are supposed to be used for extreme, dangerous situations like hostage crises, they now end up getting used for virtually everything. From crowd control to low-level drug raids.
The U.S. incarcerates more people than any other nation at more than 2 million inmates, which has quadrupled since 1980.
Half the people in federal prison are there on drug charges, and it accounts for a quarter of admissions to state prisons. And of course, it's tricky to know how to feel about all this because, on the one hand, the war on drugs has completely solved our nation's drug problem, so that's good. But on the other hand, our drug laws do seem to be a little draconian and a lot racist, because while white people and African Americans use drugs about the same amount, a study has found that African Americans have been sent to prison for drug offences at up to 10 times the rate.
With such an influx in prisoners in the U.S., private prison companies are on the rise, and the more inmates they house, the more money they make. More than 10% of U.S. prisons are privately operated and hold more than 130,000 people, or about 8% of inmates. The two biggest prison companies, the GEO Group and the Corrections Corporation of America, accrue more than $3 billion a year between them, and 40% of their revenue comes from the federal government. They are also exempt from paying federal taxes. Unlike their public counterparts, private prisons are accountable to shareholders, investors, and hedge funds. The CCA's annual shareholder reports over the past few years show an aggressive business plan based on building prison beds and contracting them to government authorities, sometimes with decades-long contracts mandating minimum occupancy rates as high as 90%. Profits, after lining the pockets of shareholders, are used to create more beds and to lobby state and federal agencies to deliver more prisoners to fill them.
And while their marketing materials emphasise how much they do to help their prisoners rebuild their lives, their pitch to investors has been a little bit different.
In a recent investor presentation, CCA pitches its unique investment opportunity. Another reason investing in the jailing of people makes good financial sense: high recidivism.
Oh, that is a great way to reassure your investors. Look, we see your concerns, what if we fully rehabilitate the prisoners and they become fully functional members of society? Well, don't worry, that's not the kind of company we're running here, don't worry. The key problem with running prisons as businesses is that prisons are then run as businesses. pay and staffing ratios are so much lower that a GEO Group youth facility in Mississippi sometimes had just 2 officers overseeing as many as 256 prisoners. That facility eventually closed, but only after a federal judge wrote that physical and sexual abuse was rampant there because its operators had allowed a cesspool of unconstitutional and inhuman acts and conditions to germinate. Now, I know that GEO will say that presents an unbalanced picture of their company, so in the interest of balance, I will point out that they got an award from the state of Florida citing their bold and innovative cost-saving business practices.
The drug war is imperative to private prison companies like CCA and the GEO Group. They have spent millions funding pro-drug war politicians and have used front groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council to pass harsh sentencing requirements for drug crimes.
What I've said all along is that this is an opportunity for the taxpayers of the state to save money. There's no way we'll do this if we don't save money. As you know, what the bill says is that if we don't save at least 7%, we don't do prison privatization.
Hey. Listen, if you think Rick Scott is going to look the other way for a company with a history of the physical abuse of minors for savings of a mere 6%, you don't know Rick Scott, OK? If you happen at all to be interested in asking Rick Scott about the conduct of the GEO Group, for goodness sake, don't do it tomorrow night. He's busy. We actually checked, and he's going to be at a fundraiser at the home of, and this is true, the CEO of GEO Group.
Like prisons, prison guard unions also have a vested interest in keeping people behind bars. In 2008, the California Correctional Peace Officers Association spent about $1 million to defeat a measure that would have reduced sentences and parole times for nonviolent drug offenders while emphasizing drug treatment over prison. With no oversight, lobbyists continue to write and advocate for legislation that goes against the public's best interests and will. Lobbyists see doubt and confusion in the minds of politicians and the public through coercion and misinformation while supporting the corporate agenda and maintaining the status quo.
A lot of the political debates we see on television, in the media, are not much more than political theater propped up by characters who are saying what they're saying or pushing a certain policy because someone's paying them and you don't know who they are. They'll say, oh, this is to help the Democrats or to help the Republicans, but in many cases, they're pushing a very narrow corporate interest without revealing who their true paymasters are.
His arms were so close, I could see the blood pulsing through his wrist. Don't tell me the cops are back in a room like this, 'cause policemen shot my